Hey guys, welcome back to The Readers. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is an entitled People Story. Ever had a landlord who was a total nightmare? Mine was secretly running a dangerous, illegal operation with 18 units in a building zoned for 6. When I moved out, he tried to steal my deposit with fake charges. He thought I'd just let it go. But what he didn't know is that his own words would be his downfall. I moved into the apartment building on Larkin Street in late fall when the rent was still semi-reasonable and I was desperate enough to overlook a few red flags. The landlord, let's call him Rick, seemed normal enough during the showing. He was in his 50s, wore pressed khakis, and gave me the whole song and dance about how he ran a professional operation and expected quality tenants who respect the property. The apartment itself was a one-bedroom on the 3rd floor of what used to be a grand old Victorian house that had been carved up into separate units sometime in the past few decades. The hardwood floors were scratched to hell, the bathroom tiles were cracked, and the kitchen appliances looked like they'd survived the Cold War, but the location was decent, and the rent was just barely within my budget as a graduate student. I signed the lease, handed over first month's rent plus a hefty security deposit of $1,500 and moved in with my secondhand furniture and boxes of books. The problem started almost immediately, but they were the kind of annoying issues you expect in an older rental. The heating was temperamental, clanking and hissing like it was possessed. The water pressure was pathetic. The windows didn't quite seal properly, so cold air whistled through the gaps. I reported these things to Rick through the email address he'd given me, and he'd respond with vague promises about looking into it that never materialized into actual repairs. But I was busy with my graduate program, working part-time at the university library, and generally trying to keep my head above water academically and financially. I didn't have the energy to fight about every little thing, so I bought a space heater, got used to lukewarm showers, and stuffed towels against the drafty windows. The real eye-opener came about 3 months into my lease when I started noticing things that seemed off about the building itself. There were way more people coming and going than seemed right for the number of units that should have existed in the building. I'd see different faces in the hallways constantly, people I'd never seen before carrying groceries or laundry. The mailboxes in the entryway only had slots for 6 units, which matched what I thought the building contained, but the foot traffic suggested otherwise. One night, I couldn't sleep because of noise from somewhere above me. It wasn't coming from the 4th floor apartment that I knew existed directly overhead. The sounds seemed to be coming from even higher up, from what I'd assumed was just attic space. I heard footsteps, voices, what sounded like furniture being moved around. This happened several more times over the following weeks, always late at night. My curiosity got the better of me, and I started exploring the building more carefully. That's when I discovered that Rick had converted spaces that were definitely not meant to be living quarters into rentable units. The attic had been split into at least 2 apartments, accessible through a back stairway I'd never noticed before. The basement, which I'd assumed was just for storage and utilities, had been divided into multiple cramped units with tiny windows near the ceiling. Even part of the garage had been walled off and turned into a studio apartment. I started keeping track. Between the legitimate units and these hidden conversions, I counted at least 18 separate living spaces in a building that was only zoned and permitted for 6 units. Rick was running a full-on illegal boarding house operation, packing people into every available square foot of the building and collecting rent from all of them. The worst part was the conditions some of these converted units were in. I got friendly with a guy named Marcus who lived in one of the basement units, and he showed me his place one afternoon. It was absolutely grim. The ceiling was so low he couldn't stand up straight. There was visible mold creeping up the corners. The kitchen was a hot plate and a mini fridge. The bathroom was shared with 3 other basement units. He was paying $900 a month for this hole, and he didn't even have a proper lease, just a month-to-month agreement on a single piece of paper. When I asked Marcus why he stayed, he just shrugged and said he didn't have much choice. He'd had some financial problems in the past that tanked his credit, and most landlords wouldn't rent to him. Rick didn't do credit checks or ask too many questions, which made him one of the few options for people in Marcus's situation. Rick was exploiting people who were already vulnerable, and he was making a fortune doing it. I thought about reporting what I'd discovered, but I kept putting it off. I didn't want to rock the boat. I was worried about retaliation, about Rick making my life miserable or trying to evict me. I told myself it wasn't really my problem, that I should just mind my own business and focus on getting through my degree program. Then my lease came up for renewal. I'd been in the apartment for just over a year, and despite all the issues, I'd been a model tenant. I paid rent on time every single month, never complained too loudly about the lack of repairs, kept the place clean, didn't throw parties or cause problems. I figured I'd earned the right to either renew at the same rate or maybe negotiate a small increase that kept pace with inflation. Rick had other ideas. He sent me a lease renewal offer that increased my rent by 35%. Not $35, 35%. My rent would jump from $1,200 a month to $1,620 for an apartment that still had the same broken heating, the same pathetic water pressure, the same drafty windows that had never been fixed despite a year of complaints. I tried to negotiate. I sent Rick a polite email pointing out that I'd been a reliable tenant, that the apartment still had all the maintenance issues I'd reported when I first moved in, and that a 35% increase seemed excessive and unreasonable. His response was brief and dismissive. He said the market rate had gone up, that he could easily find other tenants willing to pay the new rate, and that if I didn't like it, I was welcome to move out at the end of my current lease. I spent a week apartment hunting and quickly realized that Rick was right about one thing. The rental market had gotten even worse over the past year. Everything in my budget was either further away, in worse condition, or both. I ran the numbers a dozen different ways, but I couldn't make a move work financially without either taking on more debt or dropping out of my program to work full-time. Backed into a corner, I decided I'd have to move out anyway and crash with friends or find a roommate situation somewhere. I gave Rick notice that I wouldn't be renewing and that I'd be vacating the apartment at the end of my lease term. I spent my last month there packing up my stuff and deep cleaning the apartment. I know some people trash their apartments when they're angry at their landlords, but I'm not wired that way. I cleaned that place until it was probably in better condition than when I'd moved in. I patched nail holes, scrubbed the oven, wiped down all the baseboards, the whole 9 yards. I took photos of everything too. I'm not sure what made me do it, but something told me to document the condition I was leaving the place in. I photographed every room from multiple angles, close-ups of the clean appliances, the patched walls, the scrubbed bathroom. I even took a video walkthrough on my phone narrating what I was showing and adding the date stamp. I did the final walkthrough with Rick on my last day. He barely looked around, just kinda wandered through the rooms with his hands in his pockets. The apartment was spotless. There was literally nothing he could point to as damage or excessive wear. When we finished, I asked him about the timeline for returning my security deposit. He got this smug little smile on his face and said the law required him to send an itemized statement within 30 days, and that he'd be in touch. Something about his tone set off alarm bells, but there wasn't much I could do except wait. 30 days passed. No check, no statement. I sent him an email asking about the status. No response. I sent another email a few days later. Nothing. I tried calling the phone number I had for him and he didn't pick up. I left a voicemail. He never called back. Finally, 37 days after I'd moved out, I got a letter in the mail at my new address. It was the itemized statement, and I had to read it 3 times because I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Rick was claiming $947 in deductions for repairs and cleaning. The list included things like carpet cleaning for $300. The apartment had hardwood floors, no carpet. Painting for $400. The walls were in perfect condition and the lease didn't require me to repaint anyway. And deep cleaning of $247 for an apartment I'd spent days scrubbing. The really insulting part was that he'd included a check for the remaining $553 from my $1,500 deposit. He knew exactly what he was doing. By sending me back a portion of the deposit, even with bogus deductions, Rick was gambling that I wouldn't bother to fight over $900. For him, it was found money. For a broke graduate student, it was nearly a month's rent at my old rate, but probably not worth the time and expense of taking him to small claims court. Or so he thought. I was furious. I stared at that itemized list of fabricated charges and felt my blood pressure spike. This wasn't just about the money anymore. This was Rick being a predatory slumlord who thought he could take advantage of people because we didn't have the resources or knowledge to fight back. He'd been doing this for years, probably to every tenant who moved out, just automatically stealing a chunk of everyone's security deposit because most people wouldn't push back. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Marcus in his moldy basement cave, about all the other people Rick was exploiting, about the way he'd dismissed my attempts to negotiate the rent increase, about that smug smile when I asked about my deposit. And I thought about something Rick had said to me once, back when I first moved in and asked about getting the heating fixed. He told me very seriously that as a tenant I had a responsibility to follow all applicable housing laws and regulations. He'd lectured me about how important it was that everyone operate within the legal framework and how he ran a by-the-book operation. At the time, I'd thought he was just being pompous. Now, those words took on a different meaning. If Rick wanted everyone to operate within the legal framework, then I was going to make absolutely sure he was operating within the legal framework too. I started doing research. I looked up the zoning laws for the neighborhood where the building was located. It was zoned for residential use, but with strict limits on the number of units allowed based on the building's size and layout. The property records I found online showed that Rick's building was only zoned and permitted for 6 residential units, exactly what I'd suspected. Then I looked up the building codes and permit requirements. I went down a rabbit hole reading city and state regulations about converting spaces into residential units. Turns out there's a ton of regulations, permits, inspections, safety requirements I'd never even heard of. Things about egress windows, ceiling heights, ventilation. I was pretty sure Rick hadn't followed any of them. I did some research about security deposits too, and that's when I found out that in my state, if a landlord wrongfully withholds a security deposit, the tenant can sue for up to 3 times the amount withheld plus attorney fees. I hadn't known this before, but it suddenly made fighting back seem a lot more worthwhile. Rick stealing $900 could cost him almost $3,000 if I could prove the charges were bogus. And I had all those photos and videos. I documented everything I could remember about the building. I drew up a rough floor plan showing where all the different units were located. I wrote down descriptions of the conditions in the units I'd seen, particularly the basement apartments with their mold and inadequate ventilation. I gathered up all my correspondence with Rick, every email where I'd reported maintenance issues that he'd ignored. Then I found the website for the State Housing Authority and looked up how to file a complaint. They had an online form specifically for reporting unlicensed rental units and building code violations. I filled it out methodically, including every detail I could think of. I attached my floor plan, photos I'd taken of the building exterior showing the different entry points, and copies of my correspondence with Rick. In the section asking why I was filing the complaint, I wrote something along the lines of, I am a former tenant reporting serious violations because the landlord has demonstrated a pattern of prioritizing profit over tenant safety and legal compliance. The landlord specifically instructed me that it was essential for all parties to operate within the legal framework and maintain a by-the-book operation. I am ensuring that the property is operating within the legal framework as the landlord insisted was so important. I hit submit and felt a wave of satisfaction wash over me. Malicious compliance at its finest. Rick wanted everything by the book. He was about to get the book thrown at him. I didn't hear anything for almost 2 months, and I started to wonder if my complaint had just disappeared into some bureaucratic black hole. I'd almost given up on it when I got a call from an inspector at the Housing Authority. She asked me a bunch of questions about the building, how long I'd lived there, what I'd observed, whether I'd be willing to provide a written statement. I answered everything honestly and told her I'd cooperate however she needed. She didn't give me too many details about what would happen next, but she did mention that they took illegal unit conversions very seriously, especially when there were potential safety issues involved. Buildings that didn't meet code requirements were fire hazards and put residents at risk. They'd be sending inspectors out to do a thorough investigation. While I was waiting to hear back about the housing complaint, I also filed paperwork in small claims court over my security deposit. The filing fee was about $75, which hurt my already tight budget, but I was committed at this point. I served Rick with the court papers and claimed the full amount he'd wrongfully withheld plus the treble damages allowed under state law. A few weeks after the housing inspector called me, I got a text from Marcus. He'd been forced to move out of his basement unit when the state shut it down, but he'd managed to find a room in a better place. He told me that inspectors had shown up at the building unannounced. They'd gone through every floor, documented everything, and interviewed tenants. Marcus said Rick had been there and looked like he was about to have a stroke. The state didn't mess around. Once their investigation confirmed what I'd reported, they hit Rick with a cease and desist order for the unlicensed units. He was required to immediately stop renting out any unit that didn't have proper permits and licensing. That meant 12 units worth of rental income just evaporated overnight. The tenants in those units had to be relocated, and the state gave Rick something like 30 days to help them find alternative housing. But it got better. The building inspector also found numerous code violations throughout the property, including the ones I'd been complaining about since I moved in. The heating system was ancient and potentially dangerous. The electrical wiring in some of the converted units was a fire hazard. The basement units had mold that required professional remediation. The attic units didn't have proper egress, which meant people could be trapped in a fire. Marcus heard from other tenants that the fines were massive, supposedly in the tens of thousands of dollars, and that wasn't even counting what it would cost to actually fix everything. Rick was looking at both the immediate financial hit from the fines and the long-term cost of bringing the building up to code if he wanted to keep operating it as a rental property at all. My small claims court date came around a few weeks later. I showed up with a folder full of documentation. My lease, the itemized deduction list Rick had sent, all the photos and videos I'd taken of the apartment's condition when I moved out, printouts of emails. I was nervous as hell, had never been to court before for anything. Rick didn't even show up. I still had to present my evidence to the judge and walk through the itemized deductions Rick had claimed, explaining why each one was fraudulent. The carpet cleaning charge when there was no carpet. The painting charge when my lease didn't require repainting and the walls were in good condition anyway. The deep cleaning charge when I had photo evidence of how clean I'd left the place. The judge asked a few clarifying questions about the lease terms and the condition documentation. She looked through some of my photos, asked me to confirm the dates they were taken. After reviewing everything, she ruled in my favor. I was awarded the full amount I'd requested, the $947 Rick had stolen, times 3, plus court costs, total of about $3,000. I left the courthouse feeling like I was walking on air. Not just because of the money, though that definitely helped, but because I'd stood up for myself and won. Rick had counted on me being too intimidated or too broke or too busy to fight back, and he'd been wrong. But the real satisfaction came from watching Rick's whole operation fall apart. The state had launched a full audit of all of Rick's properties after the investigation into the Larkin Street building. Marcus kept me updated on what he was hearing through the tenant grapevine. Turns out Rick owned 3 other buildings in the area, and he'd been running the same scam at all of them, cramming illegal units into every available space, exploiting vulnerable tenants, ignoring maintenance and safety issues. The state came down on him like a ton of bricks. Marcus told me the fines across all his properties were well into 6 figures. Several of his buildings were declared uninhabitable until major repairs and renovations were completed. The cost of bringing everything up to code was estimated at several $100,000, money Rick apparently didn't have because he'd been leveraged to the gills buying up properties to run his slumlord empire. Rick tried to fight some of the violations and fines, but it was a losing battle. The evidence was overwhelming, and the state wasn't backing down. Marcus heard that Rick ended up having to sell off most of his properties just to pay the fines and avoid criminal charges. The building on Larkin Street sold to a developer who was planning to renovate it properly and convert it back to single-family use. Marcus also told me that some of the displaced tenants had gotten together and were working with a tenants' rights lawyer to go after Rick for various violations. They'd pooled their resources to hire someone who could actually take him on. I got contacted about joining them, and I did. That case was still working its way through the system last I heard, but word was that Rick's insurance company had already started trying to settle because they knew they were gonna lose. The best part, though, was hearing through the grapevine that Rick was basically ruined. His slumlord operation had been his full-time income and now it was gone. He couldn't get financing to buy new properties because of his legal troubles. Other landlords in the area knew what had happened and wanted nothing to do with him. His reputation was destroyed. All because he got greedy and decided to steal $900 from a graduate student who didn't have the money to fight back. All because he thought he was untouchable, that he could exploit people indefinitely without consequences. All because he was so sanctimonious about everyone else following the rules while he ignored every rule in the book. I never saw Rick again after everything went down. Marcus told me he moved to another part of the state and was supposedly trying to start over. I do not know if that worked out for him. I also do not care very much. What I do know is that the Larkin Street building was sold to a developer who planned to renovate it properly and convert it back into a legal single-family home. Several of Rick's other properties were shut down or sold after the state audit. The fines were massive, the repair costs were worse, and his reputation as a landlord was destroyed. The tenant lawsuit continued after that. I joined it when I was contacted, mostly because Marcus and the other displaced tenants deserved some kind of justice too. They had been living in unsafe basement and attic units while Rick collected rent and ignored every regulation that existed to keep people alive. My small claims judgment was the first personal win. The housing investigation was the bigger one. Rick had counted on me being too broke, too busy, or too intimidated to fight over $947, and honestly, if he had just returned my deposit, I might have walked away. I probably would have finished grad school, complained about him to friends, and moved on with my life. But he got greedy. He charged me for carpet cleaning in an apartment with no carpet. He charged me for painting walls that were already clean. He charged me for deep cleaning after I had spent days scrubbing the place better than when I moved in. Then he ignored my emails and waited for me to give up. I did not give up. I took him to small claims court and won treble damages. Then I reported the illegal units, the unsafe conversions, the mold, the fire hazards, the broken heating, and every other code violation I knew about. Rick always loved saying he ran a professional by-the-book operation, so I made sure the state opened the book. Every page. Zoning, permits, fire safety, egress, heating, electrical, security deposits, tenant protections, all of it. These days, I am out of grad school and doing okay. I also volunteer with a tenant rights group now, mostly because I know how intimidating it can feel to push back against a landlord who seems to hold all the power. But sometimes the paperwork matters. Sometimes the complaint form matters. Sometimes the photos, emails, court filing, and itemized deposit statement matter. Rick thought his tenants were too desperate to challenge him. He thought wrong. All of this happened because he stole $947 from a graduate student and then had the nerve to lecture people about following the rules. Rick wanted a buy-the-book operation. He just forgot to actually read the book first. The next one is a malicious compliance story. About 15 years ago, I was almost 20 and in my country's equivalent of a trade school for electricians. One of our teachers, electronic circuits class, had a kinda annoying catchphrase for every question students had. No problems, just look in your textbook. He had already mentally checked out since he got a way better job lined up for next semester, so he pretty much only read stuff from the textbook and then switched to the textbook's practical exercises, where we had a breadboard and, working in pairs, inserted resistors, capacitors, and other components in it. All in all, not the worst teacher we had, but this one incident made his class very memorable. On the third class we had with that teacher, first one was introduction, second one was how to read resistor color codes. He said his catchphrase no less than 5 times per class. My friend showed me a glaring mistake in the textbook's practical exercise. It was something very simple. Placing 3 resistors in series, measuring the current produced with a 24V DC power supply, and comparing to the value we had calculated. The first 2 exercises were okay, but in the third one, the values for all resistors were way too low. Like 3 orders of magnitude low. Somebody meant to write 10K Heo, 10,000 Frere, but typed 10% instead, for every single resistor in that exercise. For people who are not very familiar with electronics, Ohm's law dictate that for a constant voltage supply, current gets higher as resistances get lower. Voltage equals resistance x current, or V equals Rxi, which can also be written as I equal VR. Joule's law dictate that more power, which in a resistor's case would be dissipated as heat, is supplied the higher is the current. Power equals resistance x current 2, or P equals Rxi 2. Resistors have a power rating measured in watts, and when the rating is exceeded, they start to produce smoke and/or fire. The power rating for the resistors we were using was 0.25 W. When resistors are placed in series, their total value is added. In this example, 3 10% resistors would have a total resistance of 30%. If we use the previous formulas, we get a value of 0.8 A for current and 19.2 W for power, or almost 77 times the power rating of the resistors. If the 10 KO resistors were used, we'd have 0.8 mAs for current and 19.2 mAh for power, well within the power rating of the resistors. My friend I and a few other students tried to ask the teacher if those values were correct, and his answer, to no one's surprise, was, "No problems, just look in your textbook." I tried to argue that the textbook was plain wrong, and he shut me down saying how way smarter people than him and I wrote the textbook, so we should just follow it. So everyone, some more reluctantly than others, placed the resistors in the breadboard, connected the power supply, and waited for his instruction to turn it on, as has been for the first 2 exercises without incident. Then he said to turn on the power supply, without even looking in the textbook. At first everything seemed fine, and some people started to get their multimeters. A few seconds later, a girl screamed fire, but it was really only smoke. A few seconds later, and now we had small fires all over the lab and people freaking out. Nothing spectacular, and they died down a few seconds later, but enough to make most of the 30 people scream and panic, while the smell of burnt plastic from 15 breadboards and burnt ceramic from 45 resistors made the air pretty much unbreathable. To his credit, the teacher engaged the lab's circuit breaker pretty fast and evacuated the room so no one breathed potentially toxic fumes. Since I was expecting it, I was more annoyed than scared, unlike some of the more sensitive people who were crying, and told the teacher, who was looking at the empty lab as if he was seeing ghosts, "There seems to be a problem. Should you look in the textbook now?" He gave a nervous laughter and said, "Maybe you're smarter than the people who wrote it." The screaming attracted a more experienced teacher who, after making sure everyone was okay, just couldn't stop laughing at our teacher. He did keep using his catchphrase, "No problems, just look in your textbook," until the end of the semester, but he was now also looking in the textbook himself and spotted a few glaring mistakes made by those intelligent people. For some reason, he didn't seem to like the nickname we gave him when he heard someone saying in the hallway, "Next is textbook idiots class." The next one is an entitled people story. Once upon a time, I worked as what I like to call a property shepherd. Banks would foreclose on properties and assign our real estate office to nurse the houses through the pre-foreclosure, foreclosure, eviction, and post-eviction periods. Banks liked using realtors because we essentially worked for free. I did a lot of work, and our only payment came if we sold the property at the end and earned a commission. No sale meant the bank got a ton of free labor. There was one particular mansion. It was 8,000 square feet, with membership rights to a private golf course. In a good market, it should have been worth around $3 million, but during the foreclosure years, it was valued at just under $1 million. The property was added to my list of around 900 assets at the time. To me, it was just another house, though it did come with the potential for a pretty good commission. That was the reward for taking on so many houses that were not worth nearly as much. So I went through the same checklist I used for every house. I made sure the city records listed the right names and addresses. I checked that the house physically existed because in fraud cases sometimes they did not. I made sure it had not burned down since arson on houses facing foreclosure or eviction was not unheard of. I checked whether it was occupied, whether the yard was maintained, whether water was freely flowing out of the windows, whether there were any code violations, and whether the homeowners association was foreclosing for unpaid dues. That last one mattered because homeowners association foreclosures can take priority over bank foreclosures. One of my assignments had once been taken away because the bank lost it after nobody checked for a homeowners association lien. After that, I started checking for one on every property. There were also a handful of other tasks. This house was occupied. It was already well into the eviction phase, so I expected to have possession within a month. Easy enough. Except what should have been a quick assignment turned into 5 long years. For 5 years, I did weekly occupancy checks on that house. I would drive by, take pictures documenting the condition, make sure it was still occupied and maintained, keep an eye out for code violations, and watch for homeowners association liens. Occasionally, I also delivered messages from the bank offering checks of up to $25,000 if the occupants would waive eviction and simply turn the house over to the bank through me. Nope, it was their house. They were entitled to it. Nobody could make them leave. Their lawyer was making sure they did not have to pay a dime for insurance, property taxes, or water and sewer. The bank had to keep paying the water and sewer bills and the property taxes so it would not lose the house to the city. The bank also had to assume the full insurance risk because the occupants were not paying. I asked my legal contact how this was dragging on for so long. The answer I got was technical, but basically the husband would file for bankruptcy, which automatically stayed the eviction. That process would take a couple of months to work through the system. Once it was discharged and the eviction was back on, the wife would file for bankruptcy because the husband was not allowed to file again until a certain waiting period had passed. After her bankruptcy was discharged, he would file again. They went through a few cycles of this. I was just the real estate guy, so I did not have the full picture of everything happening on the legal side. A couple of times I was told that an eviction was scheduled and that I should stand by with my locksmith and trash out crew. But each time they somehow got a stay of eviction, so it was canceled. Then one day their luck seemed to run out. I was told to get over there and follow standard procedure. The moment the bailiff told me he was done, I was to secure the house. I arrived and saw about $200,000 worth of personal property already out on the lawn. I was ready to go. But then their lawyer came running up with a writ from the judge. The eviction was canceled immediately. The bailiff gathered his crew and drove away, and I watched as the occupants started moving their property, slightly damp from the drizzle, back into the house. Now comes the part where their entitlement finally bit them hard. Yet another eviction date was scheduled. During my weekly occupancy checks, I saw no sign that they were packing up or preparing to leave. They clearly expected their legal tricks to work again, but this time they did not. The bank's lawyer told me the eviction was absolutely happening. The moves that had worked before were not available this time, so it was a firm and definite date. No ifs, ands, or buts. I did my weekly occupancy check on a Thursday and noticed a lot of people going in and out of the house. There was also a large garage sale sign in the yard, open to the public. Well, I was the public, so I went inside to take a preliminary look at the house. I wanted to get an idea of how many bathrooms and sinks would need to be winterized later. Instead, I found price tags on everything, and I mean everything. Every sink, toilet, bidet, light fixture, granite and marble countertop, oak and mahogany cabinet, pedestal sink, bathroom vanity with marble tops and underlighting, and even the solid oak doors on every bedroom and closet had price tags on them. Some fixtures were already gone. This was absolutely not allowed. Those fixtures belonged to the bank, no question. These people apparently felt entitled to strip all 8,000 square feet of the house as much as possible and get whatever cash they could. They were about to do hundreds of thousands of dollars in damage to the property. So I called the police. I explained that there was an impending eviction and that the occupants were stripping the house. Fortunately, this was a city where the police actually cared. In some places, they did not. A squad car rolled up within a few minutes. The officer told the homeowner that what he was doing was not allowed, that the sale was over, and that he had to stop stripping the house. The former borrower swore he had no idea it was not allowed and promised to stop. I did not trust him. So the next day, I decided the house needed an extra weekly check. The sign was still up. People were still going in and out of the house. I called the police immediately, and they were there again within a few minutes. This time, the officer was angry. He ordered everyone out except for the owner and his family. Then he let me look around, and I quickly spotted several missing items worth around $15,000. The officer said the ignorance excuse no longer worked because the homeowner had been told the day before. He warned him that if anything else was missing at the time of eviction, he was going to jail. Monday morning came. It was finally time for the eviction. The house was empty of all personal property, but it was missing a few fixtures. The bank was happy to finally be rid of the occupants and did not want yet another legal battle with them. I think there were still other lawsuits over the house floating around too, so the bank told me to forget about it, inventory what was missing as best as I could, and proceed as normal. The bids to make the house livable came in at around $100,000, but the bank did not want to bother. They sold the house for cash as is for exactly $1 million within 2 or 3 days of listing it. With repairs, it probably would have sold for around $1.2 million, so the bank decided it was not worth the time or effort. Anyway, thank you for watching.